Imagine a world where the greatest library on Earth doesn't reside in Alexandria or London or Washington, D.C., but in a place that, to the average Westerner, exists only as a headline on the nightly news. Imagine a time, stretching roughly from the 8th to the 13th century, when the intellectual center of gravity of the entire planet shifted away from the crumbling, Romanized ruins of Europe and landed squarely in the bustling, polyglot streets of Baghdad. It is a strange feeling to look back at the map of the world during what we in the West quaintly call the Dark Ages, and realize that while our ancestors were likely huddling in cold mud huts, arguing about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin, the scholars of the Islamic world were tearing the universe apart, trying to figure out how it worked, and writing the equations that would eventually allow us to fly to the moon. When we talk about the Islamic Golden Age, we aren't talking about a monolithic empire or a singular uninterrupted era of peace and harmony. That's a fairy tale. This was a time of tremendous political upheaval, of dynasties rising and falling in blood-soaked coups, of religious schisms that still fracture the Middle East today. But somehow, amidst the clashing of swords and the machinations of viziers, there existed a century-spanning cultural ecosystem that valued the life of the mind in a way that makes our modern age look, frankly, a little shallow. These people weren't just preserving the knowledge of the Greeks. They were critiquing it, correcting it, and building on top of it until they had erected a skyscraper of human achievement that still casts a shadow over us today. To understand how this happens, you have to strip away the modern geopolitical borders and look at the landscape in the mid-8th century. The Umayyad Caliphate had stretched from Spain to the Indus Valley, creating the largest empire the world had ever seen. But by the year 750, a revolution is underway. The Abbasids, a family claiming descent from the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, seize power. They move the capital from Damascus to a brand new city they are building on the banks of the Tigris River. They call it Baghdad. And in the founding myths of the city, the Caliph al-Mansur is said to have sat down with his astrologers and architects to lay out the plans. It was designed to be a round city, a perfect circle mimicking the cosmos. It was a statement. We are the center of the world now. But a city is just brick and mortar without an engine. And the engine that drove this golden age was an insatiable, almost aggressive curiosity. It started with a movement that, if you think about it, is one of the most ambitious intellectual projects in human history, the translation movement. The Abbasid caliphs, particularly a man named Al-Ma'mun who comes to power in 813, were obsessed with the idea that all the wisdom in the world, Greek, Persian, Indian, should be gathered into one place. Al-Ma'mun is a fascinating character. You get the sense he was a bit of a fanatic. He wasn't just a ruler. He was a patron of the sciences who reportedly had a dream where Aristotle appeared to him, telling him to seek out knowledge. When you have the absolute ruler of a superpower having dreams about Aristotle, things happen. Al-Ma'mun established the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. It wasn't a university in the modern sense, and it wasn't just a library. It was a research institute, a translation bureau, and an academy all rolled into one. And they weren't just dabbling. They were paying translators by the weight of the books in gold. Can you imagine that incentive structure today? You bring in a masterwork of Greek astronomy, you translate it into Arabic, and you get paid a literal fortune. This is where the story starts to get really interesting, because it wasn't just a copy-paste job. The scholars at the House of Wisdom realized that the Greeks, for all their philosophy, had some holes in their logic. Enter a man named Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. If you use a computer, you owe this guy a drink. He worked at the House of Wisdom in the early 9th century, and he took a grab bag of mathematical ideas from India and Greece and synthesized them into something new. He wrote a book called Kitab al-Jabr wal Muqabalah. You can hear the word algebra in there. It became algebra. But al-Khwarizmi didn't just give us algebra. He gave us algorithm. His name was Latinized into algorithmy. Imagine the leap of faith this required. Up until this point, math was mostly geometry, shapes and spaces. You could prove things visually. Al-Khwarizmi is the guy who says, no, We can do this with abstract symbols. You don't need to measure a field to solve the problem. You can manipulate X and Y in a vacuum. It is a shift from the concrete to the abstract that underpins the entire digital world we live in. Every time you type in a password or process a credit card, you're following a logical pathway laid out by a Persian scholar working in Baghdad 1,200 years ago. But the revolution wasn't just in math, it was in medicine. And here, the human stakes are incredibly visceral. In the medieval world, getting sick was essentially a roll of the dice. You had the local barber surgeon, who was good at letting blood and maybe amputating a limb. But if you had a systemic infection, you were in trouble. Then you have a guy like Al-Razi, or Razes as he was known in the West. He was a hard-nosed clinician working in Baghdad in the late 9th and early 10th century. He didn't trust the ancient authorities. He was an empiricist. He famously wrote a book in which he challenged Galen, the undisputed heavyweight champion of ancient medicine. That was like a rookie physicist walking into CERN and telling Einstein he was wrong about relativity. Al-Razi noticed that Galen's description of fever didn't match what he saw in his patients. So he wrote doubts about Galen. He was the first person to clearly distinguish between smallpox and measles. That might sound like a minor detail, but think about the chaos of a plague. If you don't know what disease you're dealing with, you can't isolate the sick. He was also the guy who pioneered the use of animal gut for sutures, catgut, which dissolves in the body. He invented surgical hooks. He set up a ward in a Baghdad hospital specifically for mental illness, at a time when the rest of the world was treating the mentally ill as possessed by demons. He didn't see them as sinners, he saw them as patients. That is a massive humanitarian leap. And speaking of hospitals, the concept of the general hospital as a public service, a place where you go for treatment regardless of your ability to pay, is largely an invention of this era. The first documented public hospital, the Bimaristan, was built in Baghdad in the 9th century. They had separate wards for different diseases. They had music therapy for the mentally ill. They had libraries. It wasn't just a place to die, it was a place to heal. But perhaps the most mind-bending figure of this era is a man named Ibn al-Haytham. He lived around the year 1000, and he is the patron saint of the scientific method. If you want to know where the modern world begins, you might want to start with him. Before Ibn al-Haytham, if you wanted to know how vision worked, you consulted the ancient authorities like Ptolemy or Euclid, who said that our eyes shoot out rays, like lasers, that hit objects and allow us to see them. It sounds ridiculous now, but if it was written by a Greek genius, people believed it for 1,000 years. Ibn al-Haytham decided he didn't care what the authorities said. He wanted to test it. And here is the drama. Legend has it that the caliph in Cairo at the time, al-Hakim, hired him to figure out how to control the flooding of the Nile. Ibn al-Haytham goes down to the river, takes one look at the engineering challenge, realizes it's impossible, and realizes that the caliph is a notoriously unstable ruler known for executing people who disappointed him. So, to save his own skin, Ibn al-Haytham feigns madness. He gets put under house arrest, and it is in this confinement, locked in a room to save his life, that he conducts his most famous experiments. He darkens his room. He punches a tiny hole in the window shutters. Light comes through the hole and projects an upside-down image of the outside world onto the opposite wall. It's a camera obscura. He realizes instantly, the eyes do not shoot out rays. Light enters the eye. He figures out that vision happens at the retina, not the lens. He writes a book called Book of Optics that wasn't just about physics. It was about how we know what is true. He argued that hypothesis must be backed by reproducible experimentation or mathematical proof. You can quote the ancients all day, but if the experiment says they are wrong, they are wrong. This is the bedrock of modern science. It is born in a prison cell by a man faking madness to avoid execution. And we haven't even touched on philosophy. This is where the story gets dangerous because, in a religious society, asking why can get you in trouble. The scholars of the Islamic Golden Age were wrestling with a concept they called falsafa, philosophy, which was heavily influenced by Aristotle and Plato. They were trying to reconcile the rational logic of the Greeks with the revealed truth of the Quran. Enter Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. This guy is the ultimate polymath. He was a Persian who reportedly memorized the entire Quran by age 10 and was practicing medicine by 16. He wrote the Canon of Medicine, a million-word encyclopedia that systematized medical knowledge. It was so good, so comprehensive, that it was the standard textbook in European medical schools until the 17th century. That's 600 years of dominance. But his real passion was trying to answer the question, what is the soul? In his masterpiece, The Book of Healing, he tackles existence, logic, and metaphysics. He uses a famous thought experiment called the floating man. He asks you to imagine a man created spontaneously in midair, blindfolded, floating in a void where his limbs don't touch. He has no sensory input at all. He can't see, hear, or touch. Ibn Sina argues that this man would still know he exists. He would have a consciousness of his own self. This proves, to Ibn Sina, that the soul is distinct from the body. It's a purely rational argument for dualism, and it's arguments like this that terrified the conservative religious establishment. They felt that reason was encroaching on the domain of faith. This tension between reason and revelation, between science and tradition, is the engine of this age, but it is also the seed of its destruction. The more these scholars pushed the boundaries of what could be known, the more they pushed back against the literalist interpretations of the scripture. Now, as we paint this golden picture, we have to be careful not to romanticize it too much. This wasn't a secular paradise. These scholars existed under the protection of the caliphs, and when the caliphs changed, or when the political winds shifted, the protection vanished. There were periods of inquisition, known as the Mina, where scholars were tortured and imprisoned if their theological views didn't match the state doctrine. The fragile ecosystem of genius relied on a delicate balance of power and money. And you can feel the beginning of the end in the 11th century. A theologian named Abu Hamid al-Ghazali writes a scathing critique of the philosophers called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. He argues that the rationalists, like Ibn Sina and al-Farabi, have drifted so far into Greek logic that they have lost the faith. He accuses them of heresy. While Ghazali was a brilliant mind himself, arguably the greatest theologian in Islamic history, his work dealt a massive blow to the idea that you could use pure reason to understand God's creation. He essentially helped close the door on the type of freewheeling, speculative inquiry that had characterized the Golden Age. But if the intellectual climate was cooling in the East, the story takes a strange turn in the West. While the Abbasids in Baghdad were dealing with decline, fragmentation, and eventually, the Mongol hordes, the spirit of the Golden Age was still very much alive in Al-Andalus, in Islamic Spain. Córdoba was a city of 500,000 people at a time when London was a muddy town of 20,000. It had paved streets, streetlights, and a library with 400,000 books. It is here, in the contact zone between the Muslim world and Christian Europe, that the legacy of the Golden Age really passes the torch. In the city of Toledo, after Christians reconquer it in 1085, they find libraries full of these Arabic texts, books on astronomy, medicine, algebra, philosophy, many of which had been lost to the Latin world for centuries. A massive translation effort begins. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars work together to translate these Arabic works into Latin. This is the shock that wakes Europe up. When you read the works of Aquinas or Roger Bacon or Dante later on, you are reading the intellectual descendants of Avicenna and Averroes, Ibn Rushd. The numbers we use today, the Hindu Arabic numerals 0 through 9, come to us through this filter. The word chemistry comes from alchemia. The stars, so many of them, Aldebaran, Altair, Betelgeuse, have Arabic names because the Arab astronomers were the ones who meticulously mapped the heavens while Europeans were looking at the ground. And then, of course, comes the apocalypse, the tragic, violent end to all of this potential. In the early 13th century, the Mongols exploded out of the steppes of Central Asia. They were arguably the most efficient fighting force the world had ever seen, a blitzkrieg of horse archers that swept away everything in their path. They destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire. They sacked Kiev. They terrified Vienna. And in 1258, under the leadership of Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, they turned their eyes to Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliphate was a shell of its former self by this point, corrupt and militarily weak, but the city itself was still a symbol. The Siege of Baghdad is one of those events that historians look back on with a shudder. The Mongols breached the walls. What followed was a week of unmitigated slaughter. The estimates vary wildly, but it is possible that hundreds of thousands of people were killed. The Grand Library of Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, maybe the greatest repository of human knowledge up to that point, was thrown into the Tigris River. The chroniclers say the river ran black with ink for days. Think about that image. The collected wisdom of centuries, books on irrigation, optics, poetry, astronomy, medicine, dumped into the water, turning it into a sludge of dissolved history. It is a moment of cultural suicide on a massive scale. The Mongols were essentially destroying the hard drive of human civilization. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 is often cited as the definitive end of the Islamic Golden Age. And in a macro sense, it is. The political fragmentation that followed meant that no single Islamic state could ever again marshal the resources to support such a massive, centralized intellectual project. The center of gravity shifted. The Islamic world remained sophisticated and cultured, particularly in the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires, but the explosive, risky, cutting-edge research, the willingness to question everything, began to wane just as Europe was waking up. But here is the reflection we have to sit with as we close the chapter on this era. It is too easy to look at the Islamic world today, rife with conflict and often lagging in.